expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX's board, staff, or underwriters.
Good day. You are listening to Ability Radio. I'm one of your hosts, Amelia Headley-LaMont of the Disability Rights Center of the Virgin Islands, and today I am joined by our special guest, Paula Whatley Matabane. Paula Matabane is a retired professor of the Howard University School of Communications. She is a spiritual director and an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Good day, Paula Matabane. How are you?
Hello there, my dear friend, Amelia. I'm good.
It is so good to talk
in Atlanta, Georgia.
In Atlanta, Georgia. Where there are a lot of Virgin Islanders live in the Atlanta, Georgia area. So, you know.
They need to take advantage of where they are from. I don't know why you want to come to America. Leave that beautiful environment down there.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah. Well, you know, probably for the same reasons why folks from the South did the Great Migration, you know? Yeah. It's about the economics, I suspect, you know, and maybe other questions. So, but let's talk about you and you.
Yeah, I want to kind of bring this story around.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's assume now we're talking short because this is a separate installment.
Yeah.
Let's talk. Yeah, go ahead.
See, this is the thing that has happened, and I know why there are Virgin Islanders here, because Jim Crow is gone. See, when I grew up, I was born and raised in Atlanta. As I said, I was born in a colored hospital. I was born a Negro in a colored hospital on the colored side of town. I drank colored water, rode in the back of the bus, went to segregated schools, et cetera, et cetera. And when I grew up, there were only two kinds of people in the state of Georgia. You were either black or you were white. And I'm sure there were some people from the Caribbean here, but they were far few and in between. Because who's going to come somewhere and be discriminated against?
Right.
You know, if you're born into it, then that's, you know, that's the hand you've been dealt.
Right.
But nobody's going to migrate into racism. You know, you're just not going to. That would have been like migrating to apartheid South Africa. You're just not going to do it. So, but this is where, so now the question comes up in terms of what can you accomplish and achieve within that? And the big question that's always been with me is, how did my ancestors make it over?
Right.
And my mother's family, it was my father's, but I'm not going to talk about him today, came from extremely humble beginnings. My grandfather was actually born a slave in 1964 in Russell County, Alabama, right across the Chattahoochee River from Georgia.
Okay, 1864.
Yeah, 1864. That's at 19.
Yes. Okay.
After me, born after I was. 1864. So he was born the chattel property of someone. And my grandmother was born in 1881 in South Georgia. They had 6 children that grew to adulthood. So my mother had 4 brothers, and then there were the 2 girls.
Okay.
So of the 6 children, all 6 of them got college degrees.
Wow.
And 3 of my mama's brothers received graduate degrees from Harvard. I didn't say Howard. I said Harvard University the same year of 1942.
Wow.
And and one of those brothers he got his undergraduate degree from Harvard in 1940. He was in the class with John F. Kennedy. And then 2 years later, the 3 of them, one got it in law. He got his in law, one in engineering, one in chemistry. So there is, and then my mother got her master's degree in education. So, you know, like, there is something that is there. There's some spiritual, intellectual, social resources that were in this environment that allowed some people to succeed and succeed well. Now, I must say that none of them became wealthy. They did all right, especially, the one that was a chemist, because he ended up working in corporate America. He was the first Black research chemist for Merck chemical company in Rahway, New Jersey. And my uncle, the one that got his undergraduate degree from Harvard, he went to Ghana in 1958 at the request of Kwame Nkrumah, because he knew him in the States at Lincoln University. And after Ghana got its independence, he invited my uncle to come over there with his family and, to work with him with that. So, like my mother's family has just been all over. One of them was a dean of engineering at Tuskegee Institute. So, it's this family has done a lot with parents who finished the 6th grade and the 10th grade.
Yeah, that's
and
fantastic.
Came out of stark, and when I say stark poverty, I mean stark poverty and all of the stuff that's, like the systematic racism designed to crush you down. So I've always had this question of how did they come through? How did they survive? Like, why did they succeed? Why did they? It's a very strong family. And even in my own family, we still have, these levels of achievement with my parents and then my brothers, my first cousins, and so forth. But I've always had a different kind of a spiritual connection to this grandmother, Mrs. Ione Willie Lee Jackson Davis. And in the memoir, connected to her memoir, I have added in my story of how what I call the spirit. It's like divine spirit, God, and the ancestral spirits, the ones that I never knew, working in concert to really assign me this task of bringing my grandmother's story forward in order to illustrate how a family that was crushed down by poverty was able to raise up and come out healthy. They didn't come out as drug addicts. They didn't come out as alcoholics. I'm not saying they were perfect. Everybody got some issues going on. And it was very important for me because I got caught up in the theodicy question. How does a good God allow such a horrific system of racism to flourish and exist, to press down Black people? We did nothing to deserve being enslaved, nothing to deserve being Jim Crowed, with this, all this rampant racism and violence against us, just gratuitous like this. And my grandmother died the day before my 19th birthday in 1968. And and that was the same year Dr. King was killed. And so that was a harrowing year for me. And I just kind of lost it on the spiritual realm. And, over the next few years, I just kind of divorced God because I was just really angry. Death can do that. If nobody's explaining things to you and helping you along in your spiritual growth and understanding, they're just giving you the same old, well, she's in a better place now. Ain't me telling me no stuff like that. Or, let's just wait on the Lord and you'll see, and this and that. I needed answers. And nobody was giving. So that's really how I became a political activist, because at least the activists, the leftists, were trying to do something about oppression, about racism. Because, and that's how you and I met. I won't say the battlefield because we weren't soldiers like that, but out there in the field, being active, like you and I were definitely wedded to direct action.
Right.
We kind of took up from where the civil rights movement left off after the assassination of Dr. King. You see, there was a lull in that period too, because the movement just kind of scattered and splattered, and as the leaders were struggling and fighting it out, and King's absence was major.
It was.
It was a major, like we lost ground, but then we picked it back because this awareness of the liberation movements in Southern Africa,
Right.
in particular South Africa, because like they were under this system of apartheid, which was like slavery and Jim Crow.
Right.
And I don't know if you've ever been to South Africa. I mean, I had the opportunity. I went there in 1988 when it was still under apartheid. And I have to say, Amelia, I just have never seen such evil and meanness.
Mm.
I had been to many parts of Africa, West Africa and Zambia, some other places. And, I mean, of course, there's a lot of poverty, underdevelopment in Africa. But I had just never seen such stark, evil, meanness, gratuitous.
Yeah, meanness.
I just...
Well, tell us, I mean, one of the things that we had talked about before was that Dr. King, Martin Luther King, had a mentor, so to speak.
Okay.
And his name was Howard Thurman, which you described as a theological powerhouse. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes. And again, that's where one of those sinkholes is.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody was telling us about Howard Thurman.
Mm.
If I had learned about Howard Thurman, I would have gotten answers to my questions, and I probably would not have divorced God when I did. But Thurman is what we would call a mystic, a person who really, a contemplative, who really had a strong relationship, unity with God, just a oneness with God. And he traveled to India in the 1940s when India was working on its independence from British colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And he learned a lot from Mahatma Gandhi about nonviolent resistance. And while he was there, one of the Hindu hosts asked Thurman, "Man, why are you here representing Christianity?" Given the way that was the religion of the slave masters, and the way that, people leave, like there were stories, like of white people interrupting church to go participate in a lynching, no love whatsoever. And so he was moved to write this book called Jesus and the Disinherited, in which he tries to lay out the understanding of Jesus from the point of view of Black suffering people who have gone through slavery. And he says, it's not what does Jesus say about the disinherited, but what does he say to them? How does he address them and where they are, and what are the viable alternatives for them in order to overcome, to rise up and be able to do the kind of thing that King did, Rosa Parks, the whole civil rights movement, because most of those people were church people.
Right.
So it's a seminal work, and I would really encourage people, this Jesus and the Disinherited. I would encourage anybody has an interest in that, and I would think that people on that island would probably find a lot of points of agreement and understanding in terms of how, in terms of the development of their own faith, as descendants of enslaved people.
Right.
It's a very, very powerful book. And at Morehouse College, they have the King Chapel, because both King and Thurman are graduates of Morehouse.
Mm-hmm.
So they have the King Chapel, but the monument in front of the King Chapel is of Howard Thurman. So he's really one of the great theologians of the 20th century. And of course, because, like so much of Christianity is Eurocentric, it's just now that people are beginning to, I mean, like the mainstream church, like, because Black people are saying, no, you got to pay attention to Howard Thurman, so then they say, oh, yeah, right.
Hmm.
And then they're shocked to see how he was so advanced. He's written a lot of books on meditation, different, on meditation, and so his stuff is powerful. It's not just about race. It's about relationship with God.
I noticed that he, in 1944, along with a man by the name of Alfred Fist, founded the first interracial, interdenominational church in the United States.
Yeah, in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And again, it's like one of those black holes. I'm so angry because I went to Stanford. I was there in 71, 72 for grad school. And I didn't know about it, because, like I would have driven up.
Sure.
If I had known, driven, from Stanford up to San Francisco. I used to go up there and visit some of my cousins. But nobody, again, people don't tell you. And it just, so I guess it just wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to become a political activist, which I wouldn't have known you maybe if I had.
So, okay, here's okay, from the activism, because I'll be honest, I was surprised to hear that you were preaching. So
yeah, that's a joke.
Yeah, so I'd like to tell me about that evolution. I mean, it may have been something that was always there, like you described, and then, your grandmother passing and Dr. King assassination, and saying, how can there be something that allows this kind of horror to occur? So I'd be curious about Paula Matabane's return, so to speak.
Well, what I would say is that, first of all, the Holy Spirit has a great sense of humor. He called me into the mix. Because like I said, I had divorced God. But in the memoir, I was putting stuff together, and I'm beginning to see these spiritual connections with my grandmother. So my mother's oldest brother died in 1960. And we had to go to Columbus for his funeral. And while we were there, I was in the bedroom with my mama, my grandmama, and his widow and two other aunts. And as we were leaving, my grandmother started crying and talking. And she said something very interesting. She said, when I die, I want Paula to get all my things. Well, I was the only granddaughter at the time. And I'm looking around like, man, I don't want grandmama's stuff. This is old lady stuff. I don't want this stuff. So anyway, 8 years later, grandmama dies. And it hits me like a ton of bricks. And I was grieving. And one night I had a dream. I was in Philadelphia. I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I was grieving. But I was asleep, and I had a dream. And I dreamed about my grandmother, that she was hovering above me, and she told me to stop grieving her. She said, because death is just one point on the circle of life. Now that went over my head, just like having all her things. But being assigned all of her things was the best thing in the world for me, because it meant that I got the memoir. And the aunt, my mother and the aunt that was there, they had all of her stuff, her sacred stuff.
Right.
My grandmother had letters. She had speeches she had written. She had the memoir. She had books and her Bible, and she had, made some interesting notes in there. I mean, for this woman who had finished 6th grade, that was a lot.
She did speeches?
Yeah. Yeah. She spoke in, like in church.
Okay. That's still
because my grandfather was a pastor.
Okay.
So, and then when I did go back to church, this is the other thing. When I did go back to church, I was in Maryland. And I was looking for a church to go to. And this is when I was still divorced from God, but I wanted a church. I wanted to belong to a church. Because I said, when I die, somebody in church needs to know me. So, I can bear it from that church. That was stupid thought. But I found this church, Hemingway AME Memorial AME Church, and it turns out, so I kept saying, if I could go to my grandmother's church, I would go to church. I was saying to myself. So the church that I found was a church that my grandmother used to attend. She would come up. My mama had a brother that lived in Maryland, a quarter of a mile from that church, and I didn't know it. And I just started going to that church. And it turns out that was a church that my grandmother would go to in the 40s and the 50s.
And you didn't know that before? This was just by coincidence?
Yeah. Well, I think it's guidance from the Spirit. I mean, like, see, I see it all now as God's divine plan. And I just, like, we don't have time for me to tell the whole story, but it seems that on a spiritual level, in terms of what God had had in store for me, that I was called into the ministry. Nobody else in my family is. Like, none of, I don't know why my mama's brothers weren't called. Their daddy was a preacher. I mean, like, why is this? It skipped all of them and fell on me. It didn't go to my brothers. It came to me. Why me? But I had the closest relationship with this grandmother. She had 5 grandchildren, and there were 3 of us in one family. And I was the one that was closest to her. And I think that's what, that the story then becomes my responsibility to present and write and develop for people to see how the Spirit moves in situations of oppression. I quote something Dr. King said the last night before he died, but he was in Memphis. And it was to the effect that you can't see the sky, you can't see the stars until it's dark. And he said, I see God moving and people responding. And that's the answer to my question. How does God tolerate all of this? It's that we can't see it until it gets dark. And we have to respond to God. God is moving. I think about Rosa Parks. First of all, Rosa Parks was a seamstress, a poorly paid seamstress, maybe with a high school diploma from a rural high school. So you would have never said, oh, yeah, well, the person who's going to start the movement that's going to overthrow Jim Crow law is going to be a high school graduate seamstress. You would have never said that. You would have said, okay, well, maybe Thurgood Marshall, like an attorney, Supreme Court judge.
Right.
We would have been looking for somebody who had a Harvard or a Howard University degree. God uses this little simple, when I say simple, humble woman. And the question is, I know that the bus driver who called the police that day, he rules the day that he called the police, because he unleashed something that turned his life upside down.
And everything else, absolutely.
And who knows his name, by the way?
Yeah, right.
Nobody knows. Nobody cares about him.
Right.
He just...
So listen, in the 2 minutes we have left.
Oh, goodness.
Your grandmother's memoir is called This Way Leads Home.
Yes.
And her name is Ione Davis. How can people find this publication? Where are we in the development of this project?
I'm in the last phase of editing. I have an editor. So kind of like in the last phase, it's written, doing that final polishing and stuff. So I'm hoping by July or August that it'll be out, and I will probably self-publish. I'm retired now. I don't have a resume. I don't answer to anybody but Jesus. So I don't have to, like, my thing is that I just want to get the story out, and I want other people to see their own lives, to see their own pathways. Because I know if I have those kind of questions about life, about God, about spirituality, connections, spiritual connections, the ancestral presence. Other people do also,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I will, you will be among the first to hear when
I'll hear a shout coming from Atlanta saying
Yes.
it's done. Well, I do want to hear when it is ready, and certainly we'll ask some questions of you, perhaps when it's finally completed. So, folks, I want to thank you for taking the time to listening to us today. This has been a very enlightening conversation. Our guest today was Paula Whatley Matabane, an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Paula Matabane, it has been a pleasure. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank
you for the invitation, Amelia. I appreciate it.
Folks, have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters.